because my strategic assistant was on vacation, remembering to mash records buttons is just, a new part of my job description I'm not that great at. So our special treat today is one of my longtime friends and colleagues in the debate community who we have found, he lives in Austin and has for a few years. We bump into each other probably once every 2 years in person, even though we're 30 minutes away. But we have just found that on repeat, many of the skills that contribute to successes or perceived successes in our day jobs are transferred skills from our passion and important moment in our life of learning high school speech and debate skills and picking them up and translating them. And so what we have today is probably years and years in the making of trying to merge these two models together of what we learn in high school speech and debate and what contributes to high stakes, high performance sales, selling, and value creation of any and all stripes. And Isaac is going to share with you his perspective on both of those as one of the top performers in sales at his past company and at his current company. He's closed all kinds of deals of all shapes and sizes, a lot of high-end enterprise complex deals. He coaches some members on his team. And by night in the past, he and I used to fly once a month to Florida to coach some budding high school debaters. We did that for 2 or 3 years. And he brings powerful energy. We've taught at the whiteboard many times before. And today, I hope to let some of you all into that. Before I get started, I wanted to share some very simple ground rules, which are Isaac has prepared a presentation, but one of the key parts of Dojo is that we work through the examples and day-to-day contexts of our Dojo members instead of just having classroom theory. So Isaac has been briefed on all the folks here, and some of you all also submitted a survey or something to that end to tell us about your business problems and cases. And we have in front of us today several examples from Michael, who already shared a success, who's building a company and just closed a deal in hotel land. He sells to hotels. To Mindy, who sells to kind of consumers / business owners, which makes it a weird combination of B2C and B2B when you're selling to one person at a B. And her business Show Me, which is a competitor to Udemy in very in-your-face training for founders on how to do key things that shows you the mess of their templates and real tools used instead of highly produced educational content on some of the other platforms. We have Maeve, who works in a consultancy that helps operators of small businesses really become owners of their small business by improving the cadence and structure of their operation to grow and succeed. We've got Jake, who runs a software company as well as a marketing agency and has just put forward a case where he actually has the opportunity to possibly have his software company acquired and is in a sales process for that. We have Taro, who's a product manager for an up-and-coming reverse logistics platform and is currently developing B2B case study pilots with really, really big names in the Fortune 500 world and has to develop consensus around value and also turn that into concrete action on his team. So those are just some people that are in the room of some of the cases and examples, Isaac, for you to work with. And with that, I'd love to turn it over and you run this how you want to run it. And I'll chip in here and there when it feels like maybe an example is necessary. But the ground rule here is any dojo member who is normally part of this call, please feel free to stop Isaac, just unmute yourself, verbally interrupt, and ask him for an example or ask him to work through one of your problems like you normally would. And anyone here who's a guest, please feel free to drop your questions or thoughts into the chat. And I'm going to be sort of collating those, some of which will prompt Isaac with right away, and some of which we'll save for the end of our presentation. That's going to be my job to help moderate and curate those. So please fire away in the chat. But I know from firsthand experience that trying to present on Zoom and monitor the chat yourself is one of the most, like, it's like getting 75 notifications on your phone at once while talking. Just very scattered thing to do. So I'm going to perform that service on behalf of Isaac, so he doesn't have to pay attention to the chat. So without further ado, Isaac, welcome. Thank you. And let's see what you got.
Thanks, Isaiah. I appreciate the introduction, and for all the dojo members, super great to meet y'all. And for all the folks joining us, thanks for joining us. I think Isaiah teed it up properly. For the background on me, just to provide some context for how this came about. This really just came about like organically. Isaiah and I just nerding out about how a lot of the concepts that over a decade ago we were applying to highly competitive, international level debate, like how those have transitioned almost one-to-one as far as frameworks and ways of thinking about the problem to selling. And so, my background over the past 7 years, I've been in software sales, but software sales of all shapes and sizes. I really started out in kind of the SMB commercial space, selling to marketing executives, at a company that was about 200 people, got acquired and then joined a larger company. And then, recently the company that I've been working for is much more focused on the enterprise, right? So Fortune 50, Fortune 500, a pretty highly technical sale. But I joined as employee number 60. And now the company is over 1,300 employees, with over $500 million in VC funding. And the way that the kinds of scenarios that we were encountering from when we were trying to identify our ICP and our product market fit to now where we've got more of a repeatable sales motion, understanding how this framework remains consistent but has different applications is also something that I'm kind of coming from and was speaking to with Isaiah, right? So I think when we boil it down, and really what this comes down to is I think a lot of sellers today, and again, my background is very much software sales, so I'm trying to make this more broadly applicable to the problems of the dojo, but like perhaps I'm speaking to some bias and a little bit centered around the concept of software sales. A lot of sellers, I think, in the industry are playbook reps. And what I mean by that is they're good at following a playbook that's built for them, which is if customer does X, you do Y. This is step A, this is step B, this is step C, this is step D. But really, I'd say where the difference is between like velocity sort of playbook sales and enterprise sales. And consequently, actually, funnily enough, I think early founder sales has a lot more parallels to enterprise sales than playbook velocity sales, is that a lot of times those problems in the scenarios that you're encountering are nonlinear, right? It's not a repeatable by the book motion that you can do over and over again. It's a nonlinear problem that may look different from the problems you've encountered before, or maybe variations of the problem that you've encountered before. And to really address that and understand that, it becomes less about the what questions to ask, and it becomes more about the why are you asking that question, right? It's not about what is the next step, is why would this be the next step, right? And I think that's where a lot of what I've prepared today, which by the way, is the first time I've prepared this formally. So you will be the first people to look at any of these slides. I have run through a lot of these exercises with the team that I lead over at Grafana Labs, and have seen a lot of great results from it, but typically it's more interactive whiteboarding or like, slides that quite honestly look like shit. This is going to be a little bit more polished version of that, but this will be the first run through of it. So as Isaiah mentioned, like questions here are good, clarifications of, hey, this point doesn't necessarily make sense. Can you crystallize that more for me? I certainly welcome that feedback. And the goal here is to be able to share with you some of these lessons and see how they might be able to apply to iterate on or improve currently what you're doing with your business today. So that's the tee up there. I will go ahead and share my screen now. And I also understand that typically the format of these are not really like presentations. So we'll be doing something a little bit different here, but my understanding is I'm the first guest speaker as well. So we'll kind of figure this all out together. So marrying debate and sales, leveraging debate frameworks and methodologies in enterprise sales. And I think, Isaiah made the good comment that a lot of these things are not just relevant to enterprise sales, they're relevant to any point of sales, right? So even if that's, convincing a colleague or someone internally of a different position of doing things, a lot of these things will become relevant. Again, they're just maybe a little bit more pointed and slanted towards enterprise software selling in particular. So the agenda. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about like why apply debate to sales, or debate skills and methodologies to sales. So just doing a little bit of world building around some of the parallels that I've seen from debate that are directly one-to-one applicable to the sales process, so that we can build some consensus there. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about building consensus, right? I think, one of the big mischaracterizations of debate is that debate is about arguing, and it's really not, right? One of the things that I always say is that good debaters are good at arguing, great debaters are great at listening, and world-class debaters are great at building shared assumptions and consensus with their competitors to the audience, right? Which seems like intuitively antithetical to a lot of people based on their conceptions of what debating is. So we'll talk a little bit about what that actually means, how to apply those principles, and really the benefits, the pragmatic benefits of building consensus with your competitor. And then we're going to talk next about a framework that Isaiah taught me over a decade ago, that I've taught to business professionals, I've taught to grade schoolers in Romania, I've taught to thousands of people this really simple framework for how to build an argument, which is building a claim, a warrant, and an impact. And then we're going to be applying that into the context of business and actually selling products and solutions to your customers. We're going to talk about cross-examination and applying some of those principles to the discovery process. When you think of cross-examination, very similar to what you see in like a courtroom TV drama, was very similar to what we did in debate, except it was just a lot shorter and very aggressive. But applying some of those underlying principles to sales, I think, for me, has really been a huge advantage and differentiator for how I run my sales process. And then at the end, we'll open up some room for more interactive Q&A. As Isaiah mentioned, if you've got a question, feel free to put it in the chat. For the dojo members, feel free to jump in. I'm actually going to rely on Isaiah a little bit for that as well, because he understands a little bit more about your businesses, the specific problems that you've stated. And the reality is that a lot of these underlying frameworks and skills are things that he taught me and that I've been applying for, over a decade. So he can kind of jump in here as an audible as well and figure out how some of this maybe applies to the specific problems you're encountering. So with that, again, just about me, I'm based in Austin. I'm currently a regional sales director at Grafana Labs, which means I lead a team of 6 strategic and enterprise sellers covering the Fortune 500. Prior to that, I was an individual contributor, just a salesperson at Grafana. Did pretty well there. And like I said, I joined as employee number 60, but I'm actually the number 2 longest tenured sales hire. And so I believe we have almost 200, maybe 250 people in our sort of sales or SE org. And so I've seen a lot of these changes. And the one thing that I can take away that's relevant to you is that from us figuring out what the hell our sales plays were, what was our ICP, was our product market fit, to like now with the very established sort of playbook where there's very little variations of that. All these things I'm going to teach you were applicable equally at every stage of the process. I'm a former competitive debater, competed in college, competed in high school, did really well, won a national championship in high school. And then after that, got a scholarship in debate, a large part of some of the things that Isaiah taught me. And then I've also taught this. Now, I'll give a caveat. I have not been a professional coach in over a decade, so it's a little bit rusty. I only get to experiment things on my team and use them as guinea pigs. So that's the caveat there to us doing things. I got to brush off the cobwebs a little bit in that regard. So first of all, let's talk about why applying debate frameworks to sales. So I've tried to balance this between theoretical and like pragmatic tactical. I'd say in some parts it may veer a little bit too much theoretical, so like bear with me, but I think a lot of these are important again for the world building and building the underlying framework for like why we should care about this. And really what I think this comes down to is a great quote from written by a guy named Isaiah McPeak. You may have heard of him, but this book Upside Down Debate, right, which talks about what is the purpose of debate, right? And the purpose of debate's all about decision making. And it's really demonstrating why some decisions are better than other decisions. And what that comes down to, right, is the same for sales. It's the same for business, right? Which is trying to define why make a decision, why take an action at all, right? Why take an action now versus later? Why haven't you taken an action in the past? And then why take an action with us over competitors and other alternatives, right? Other alternatives also being doing nothing, right? And at the end of the day, that's really what debate was about when I joined. It was really proving those same three things in the context of US or international policies. Like, what is the problem? Why should we do anything? Why should we do something now? What specifically should we do? Those same three questions need to be answered in the enterprise or SMB or commercial sales process. And so, really, when we think about, okay, at its core, debate and sales is really about argument building for action, taking action. You can understand that a lot of the frameworks that help you build those arguments to take action really are one-to-one and remain the same and consistent across these two pursuits. This is another example of why applying debate to sales. I'm not going to go through this. This is again from Isaiah's book. But when you think about what makes an effective debater and what makes an effective salesperson, it's critical thinking. It's a reasoned exchange of ideas. It's discrimination and judgment of what is important, what is critical, what is good, what is better, what is best, and understanding to not just focus on the good, but actually focus on the best and ignore talking about what is good because of the opportunity cost. It's about communication, about listening. That's the biggest thing that most people don't understand about debate is like the best debaters are the ones that are excellent at listening and having a perspective, having a point of view, but also being able to understand another point of view, right? So beyond the skills, again, enterprise sales at its core is about argument building for taking action. So when we understand this, we can start to draw the parallels and connect the dots. I already know what I'm about to do is show you the wrong order of transitions because I changed the order of these slides like 15 minutes ago. But in sales, in software sales and enterprise sales, there's a ton of different sales methodologies out there. There's spin selling, there's winning by design spice, there's challenger selling. Keenan wrote a book called Gap Selling, which is great. The sales methodology that I use that I personally believe is the best for a lot of reasons is command of the message. We'll be talking about that here on the next slide and what that is in case you aren't familiar. It was defined and created by basically a company called Parametric Technology Corporation, PTC, that ended up spinning off a bunch of people in a company called Blade Logic, which then started and got acquired by a company called BMC Software. But the significance of this is that all the sales folks that spun out of that have become the chief revenue officers for the highest valued software companies in the world. And so command of the message is something we'll be talking about here in a little bit and drawing parallels between a debate framework and the command of the message framework. But the core concept here is that all of these sales methodologies, whichever one you prescribe to, I'm not saying any of them are bad, inherently bad or inherently inadequate. But really, at the end of the day, again, what they're doing is they're answering those three questions, right? The three whys is why anything, why now, and why us? And these are three questions that a seller needs to be able to answer at any given moment in their sales cycle to actually have a case and make a deal forecastable, right? These are, again, the same things that are applied in policy. And again, why command of the message, just to give an example here of some of the logos, this is a framework that is very consistent to a policy debate framework, but this framework and methodology, both the framework and the methodology of command of the message, was really iterated upon, ideated by these sales leaders that went on to create companies like Snowflake, like Databricks, Datadog, a lot of the top MongoDB, a lot of the top software companies that you can think of in the world, they apply and use this same methodology, which is why we will use this as the basis for today's conversation. So that being said, this is the command of the message framework. So there's 4 quadrants. Typically, you have 3 points, and each of those 3 points has each of these 4 components. And so the first component is identifying what is the current state, what is going on in the status quo, and what are the quantifiable negative consequences that the current state is causing, right? That is impacting your business. The next thing is defining what is the future state. Where would you like to be? Where would the prospect like to be? What are the positive business outcomes that being in that future state will unlock? Sometimes those positive business outcomes are not the inverse of the negative consequences. Sometimes they are net new advantages. Talking about the required capabilities. So this is a concept in gap selling with Keenan. He talks about bridging the gap, but that's really what this is what are the vendor or product agnostic requirements, whether they're technical, whether they're financial, or whether they're holistic. A good example of holistic would be like support or expertise that your company provides, right? That bridges you from the current state to the future state. And then lastly, it's what are the success metrics, right? So how do we know that we've arrived from the current state to the future state? How do we measure that, right? So this typically comes down to quantifiable KPIs, but this is actually something that's super important because a lot of times measuring current state to future state is not binary. It is something that is a gradient, right? It is something that's on a scale. And so measuring that is really important in defining how do we measure that we've actually succeeded. Now, the interesting thing here, and this is something we'll spend a little bit less time on, is that when you look at a classic policy debate case, which is the first thing that I learned in debate, how to structure a case for taking action. It's in what we call these stock issues, right? Inherency, harms, plans, solvency, and advantages. And what you see here is that everything in the way that we lay out this case has a one-to-one parallel in arguably the most important influential sales methodology in the 21st century, command of the message. And so understanding that, again, really what this becomes about is building a framework for argument building, for taking action. It parallels exactly one-to-one from debate to sales. One thing I'll call out here is the one that's blue, if you notice, that is not in command of the message, where I actually think is a shortcoming of most enterprise sellers. We'll talk about that a little bit today is topicality. And what topicality is in debate, this is where a lot of these debates are won or lost, is defining the topic and really creating a lay of the land, creating the ground rules for how we define and talk about things. So that's a little bit too high level for, I think, for it to make sense. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But topicality is actually one way I believe taking skills from debate to identify the gaps in the standard enterprise selling process can actually up level the skills of an enterprise seller and hopefully the way that you go about selling your product or your services as well. So I'll stop there. Isaiah, I guess, how are we doing on time? And am I good to go? Any questions so far about sort of the parallels and like why this is relevant, we believe, to the selling?
Our time check is you have a whole hour left. My prompt for you is if you went back one slide, walk us through an example, maybe even with Grafana or Trendkite on like kind of filling in this algebra with how it might look, because I think that emphasis on the whole point of this is adapting from deal to deal, that you might have different answers each time, which is why it's not a playbook sell. Can you give a little more color to that?
Yeah, I think actually that might be better answered through example in the claim warrants impact section. I think with the 4 quadrants of a command of the message framework, it 100%. Yeah, I can talk about sort of, I'll give examples of that and I'll show where I see the shortcomings are typically in the command of the message implementation by salespeople, which, I mean, these are some of the best sellers in the world were for those companies that leverage this framework. So we can talk a little bit about like where are the shortcomings, and I think that should be applicable beyond software sales to some of the other problems that the dojo is experiencing.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, let's cover that there. Open mic for dojo members, and type any questions if you're in the peanut gallery before we move on.
Yeah, why is it called command of the message, or where does it get the name from?
It's a good question. As much of the etymology and history narrative building that I know around sort of force management and the PTC, they call it the PTC mafia, I actually don't know why it's called command of the message. So that's a good question. I suppose I could ask probably someone that knows a little bit more of the world building than me. Force management and the PTC mafia are also, if you're familiar at all with MEDDIC or MEDDPIC, which is like a qualification framework, metrics, economic buyer, decision process, decision criteria, paper process, identify pain, competition champion, sort of like the checklist of where are all the areas that can be gaps in your deals. They're also responsible for that checklist framework as well.
Gotcha. And when you presented those 4, I think you called them quadrants or whatever, is that the order that you typically think about it and also arrange it and communicate it?
That's a great question. So I think I typically, no, I wouldn't say it's like a start with current state, they go future state, require capabilities, it's just success metrics. I'll talk a little bit about sort of how I start discovery, but I think it's first start broad, go narrow. Like the first thing in discovery is calibration, right? So it's like understanding the lay of the land. Then two is building evidence. We'll talk about what that actually means. And then third actually is qualify in out. I think a lot of folks that are doing selling like typically think I need to qualify in, qualify out. And I think myopically focusing on that before doing calibration and building evidence actually results in you, not you, but like people asking questions that are typically jarring and disengaging because it doesn't have the context leading into it. So it's less about, I think, Tara, like starting with current state, future state, required capabilities, success metrics. And it's more about like first doing calibration, then you can build evidence, and that could be for any of those 4 points. And then it's about qualifying in, qualifying out based on the quality of those answers. But yeah, I'd say pragmatically, like typically I'm starting more with current state, like what's going on. But it doesn't necessarily need to start there. Yeah. Good question.
Can I ask one more question? Sorry to hog the mic.
Go for it.
Do you find that customers or potential customers know their current state already, or like are familiar with it, or do you have to kind of elaborate and point it out for them?
That's a really good question. I think typically customers have a general, or prospects have a general awareness of current state, but I think that a lot of times we make assumptions about their current state based on their initial response. And I think there's value in actually getting them to state those assumptions, even if they're true, because it helps them actually understand, one, better understand what their current state is. Two, it helps us avoid having the 90-10 problem, which is 90% of our understanding is right, 10% of our understanding is wrong, and that 10% is what bites us in the ass. So I think, yes, customers generally understand their current state, or at least part of the current state, but that's also why it's so important to run discovery across with multiple stakeholders of the company, right? Because sometimes they may have different pieces of the puzzle that your job then as the seller is to build the story with all those different pieces, right? Sometimes you take pieces of evidence, you take logical links from different folks, and then that's how you tell the cohesive story to the executive. So building consensus. So this is actually like the shortest part. I'd say this one is still kind of a work in progress a little bit for me in terms of like building a full-on fleshed out thing. But as I pointed out, good debaters are great at arguing. Great debaters are experts at listening. World-class debaters are expert at building shared assumptions and consensus with their competitors. So the next question is like, what the hell does that actually mean, right? So this is an example of a flow pad. In debate, we call these flow pads of basically what you're doing is start going from left to right. You're starting with the first speaker and all the points and contentions that they made. And then the next column is the next speaker. And what you're basically flowing across left to right, what are their responses or your responses to individual points of contention? Now, what you'll notice here, and this is not the best example of a slide. I found my girlfriend throwing these out like a couple of weeks ago. I was like, why are you throwing these out? So I just took a picture of them. Is that a lot of times when you start to shift left to right, the analysis actually becomes smaller, right? There's less points in each speech that follows. And why is that? It's because great debaters understand that there's an opportunity cost to trying to cover everything. And so when I was early on in debate, I'm a very fast speaker. I'm a New Yorker originally. I speak super fast. I've always spoke super fast. My strategy was to go in, and if they had 10 points, it was to respond to all 10 points within a single speech. What I ended up finding was, one, I traded persuasion and delivery for just like refutation. And so even though I was making good points, they didn't land well with the audience because of the way I was delivering them, because I was so rushed for time. Two was the audience then started putting equal weight between my greater points and my lesser points, right? So the actual points that were my strengths were valued equally or heard equally as the points that were not as important, right? And this is the whole where people say if you ask someone to remember 10 things, they'll remember 0 things. And what I actually ended up finding it in the way it really evolved my debate to the point where I started winning, most of my rounds, was understanding that the strongest thing you can do when you find your competitor makes 10 points is to mitigate as many of them as you can and focus on the ones that are the actual fundamental differentiators that are your product's greatest strengths. So in this scenario, if there are 10 things that are important to the customer, actually saying, hey, you know what? Competitor X and competitor Y, they're great at these things. We're good at them too. They're great at these things. So these things should actually not be a part of the decision criteria because these are just checklist things. Like we're all good at these things, right? That's a very clear example of a way to go build consensus, build shared assumptions. And that way, taking your 30 minutes or your hour or however much time you have with the customer to really focus on the areas that are fundamental differentiators, right? The thing that I'll call out here is one of the key things that is a really important differentiator in the command of the message framework is the difference between required capabilities and decision criteria. So required capabilities are meant to be vendor agnostic. They're supposed to be things that can be not just specific to your product, but specific to the plethora of products that are designed to solve the problems they have. These arguably could be checklist things, right? You have to do this to pay to play. You have to do this to be considered in this evaluation for a tool, right? But then beyond that, it's like, okay, assuming that 3-4 vendors meet all of your required functional capabilities, what is the decision criteria that you are applying on top of that to make a decision of which of those vendors that could be, right? So it could be most cost effective. It could be best user experience, right? It could be some of these things that are not hard binary requirements, but are things that can be measured on a scale, right? And those are things, the decision criteria are typically where you want to focus most of the conversation, assuming that you've proven that you can meet required capabilities, right? And so I'll show an example of this, but again, this is an area of, okay, if everyone meets the required capabilities, like stop talking about that, say admit that your opponent's great at that, and then go really focus on the decision criteria that are in your favor. And if the decision criteria are not in your favor, well, one, you probably shouldn't have engaged in that sales process, or two, you probably didn't do a good enough job in discovery to go influence and reshape those decision criteria. We'll talk a little bit about what
Isaac, I'll jump in there real quick with when you and I have trained debaters, we started calling that the meta, which is to understand that underneath the subject matter that we're talking about, there's like this hidden criteria that people are using to judge the information that we're debating about. And that is the meta debate. And the best debaters pull that out. And they're like, oh, well, if we look at this through the lens of cost, will you choose my opponent's side instead of my side? But if we look at this in the lens of justice, we'll choose my side and not my opponent's side. And so in sales discovery, what you're saying is like, we have to find from the group of people who make the decision, the underlying criteria, even though they're usually talking about matters of substance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. Like one of the key parts of the discovery process is understanding what their decision criteria and what are their mental models, right, for evaluating information, which is exactly what you're saying, Isaiah. And then the further step of that is to test those mental models and test the decision criteria that they're telling to you to actually validate that that actually is their decision criteria and not just what they think a good decision criteria should be. And so 100% Isaiah, and that's like a little bit more advanced discovery that I work on with my team, but 100% this is about the meta, and that becomes the prerequisite to identifying what is a required capability versus a decision criteria, and what are the decision criteria that you should lean into versus the ones that you should back off on. And this, I mean, just goes to the statement. Isaiah just said this a little while ago, and I love this. This really comes from the understanding that not everything true is important. So just something is true doesn't mean that is important, doesn't mean you should focus on it with the customer. And often, if you try to focus on everything that's true and not ranking what you state by the criticality or importance of it, there's huge opportunity cost to that. Huge opportunity cost to that in the sales process. So I'm realizing I need to continue on time here because we're already 13 minutes into the back half of this. But this is something that I typically would ask my team in a training, like, what's bad with this? What's bad with this kind of framework, this matrix, right? And engaging sort of in that discussion there. But I'll just call it out here. I mean, one is, again, by trying to compete on every single thing, your lesser and greater points are weighted equally, which means you're actually drawing focus away from your strongest differentiators, right? So this is an area where a lot of salespeople make categorical mistakes. The second is that you lose credibility, right? When you can say, hey, I actually agree with my opponent on this, and demonstrate that you are reasonable, and demonstrate that you can exercise judicious discretion, you can exercise good judgment, you actually build ethos, you build credibility with your competitor. And the inverse of that is if you're trying to compete and argue on everything, you also lose a ton of credibility. And the last thing is you also lose likability too, right? Is the reality is like there's few situations where your champion thinks your product is amazing and everyone else's product sucks. And even if they do feel that, a lot of times the other stakeholders are not going to feel that way, right? And so if you're not finding opportunities to acknowledge where your competitor is strong in discovery or in the sales process, you actually lose a lot of opportunities to be more likable, more credible. So this is a tactic we use in debate all the time. Is like actually go out of your way to call out good arguments that your competitor is making. Like obviously make sure that you've got a broader strategy of why you're calling out that's good, but that is tactically something that's super important that I think a lot of people miss in the sales process.
So if I intuitively went from that model you just have, it's just got like making me want to improv for a second. It'd be like, instead of saying complete list of dog cats comparison, which is what I think those pictures are, dogs versus cats, it would be like, yeah, cats, of course, they're easier and cheaper. And there's a lot that's similar. However, a dog will be there for you and run towards the crisis, and the cat runs away. That's what this decision is about. Mm-hmm. How close is that to a fair interpretation of what you're trying to?
100%. Yeah, and I took the dog and cats example because when I was teaching these concepts to grade schoolers and junior hires, dogs and cats and pizza and hamburgers were like the first debates we always did. Yeah. Pepsi and Coke became kind of difficult because it's like kind of the same thing. But yeah, that's exactly it. It's like calling out, hey, they're good at this. They're great at this. This is the fundamental crux of the debate. This is the fundamental crux of your decision. And this is where the actual differentiation happens. And so, something that's more optimized here is like calling out where your opponents are great, particularly on required capabilities. If you both meet them, it's like move as much as you can out of the active conversation. That's sort of just a given, sort of a stated. So it gives you more time to strategically focus on the story and world building around your key core differentiators. That's consensus building. And again, that one's a little bit of a work in progress of some more content to flesh out there, I think. Specifically more examples. But I think those are some of the tactical things that you can start to apply and think about when you talk about your product within the context of your competitive landscape. So next, let me talk about claim, warrant, impact. And so when I think about what the goals of discovery are, right, a lot of folks think about qualifying. That's the point of discovery. Some of you may be familiar with the BANT methodology. It's the first one that I used, first one that I was taught, which is budget, authority, need, and timeline. And I think that BANT, outside of like velocity, like one call close deals, is a pretty shitty methodology. And the reason why I think that is that asking those BANT questions in a vacuum without context building, without champion building, without rapport building first is incredibly jarring. And I really think that when we think about the goals of discovery, first and foremost, it is calibration. So it's defining the rules of the land. It's getting a lay of the land. It's ensuring that you and your prospect share the same assumptions, right? And then it's next about building evidence. So it's about building warrants for the claims and the impact, ideally before you even introduce the claims and the impact. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, what that means. But from my perspective, if you've done a good job at calibrating, and then you've done a good job of building out these logical links, this evidence, that naturally qualification becomes a result of that. So I actually left qualification off the slide initially, but these are some of the high-level goals of discovery and ultimately why claim, warrant, impact, again, coming to this argument building for taking action sort of framework really comes into play. And
So
so,
let's take some cases there real quick, Isaac, on the mistake to make, like putting it out of order or whatever. Let's start with Michael from Let's Tonga, who has the QR concierge kind of application, right? And he's selling to hotels. Can you just off the cuff sort of talk to how you could get this BANT piece out of order and what calibration might look like first?
me specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I think like a lot of times people use the BANT framework when they're trying to quickly qualify in or qualify out an opportunity. But like, if that's effective by just asking those BANT questions, like you're not doing selling, you're order taking. Like that is what your job is. It is not selling, right? So, example of that, classic BANT questions is just like, do you have budget for this project, right? How much budget do you have? Authority is typically like, who else is involved in this decision? Like, do you have the potential or authority to buy this product? Need is one that's, a little bit more, it's like, I try to identify the problem and timelines, like how soon are you trying to implement things? Well, those questions are asked so frequently by people that have purchased software, services, infrastructure, like whatever before, that they actually become pretty jarring because it creates a wall immediately that like, oh, this is a salesperson. And so like, I mean, in the example of Michael's problem, right? It's like understanding like what their current tech stack looks like, what they're currently doing, what are the problems. Like I think it's a pretty general answer, Isaiah. I don't think there's anything like that's magic or science to it, but like I see a lot of sellers. I've seen so many sellers jump immediately into like, when are you trying to implement a solution? And it's like identifying first, like, do they actually need a solution? And like, what are the actual problems and what are the root causes of those problems first? Like that's so much more important to building a cadence and credibility, before going anything into like purchasing questions from my point of view, right?
So let's let Michael jump into the hot seat for a second here. I hope Michael's still on. Let me double check.
Yep, I'm here.
Cool. So let's go down the calibration and just like kind of come out with a list here of some of the calibration items in one of your discussions early on in selling your software solution to a hotel. And I'll start it with, I'll open bidding with, have you all got a paid concierge staff or not, and why?
Isaiah, are you asking, or you want me to come up with an answer or more questions like that?
I want you to, more questions like that. Like, what are some other ways that you're currently calibrating or thinking about calibrating your deal long before BANT?
Right. So I think the first question is, how are you currently connecting guests to the property and things to do on the property? I try to break those up into two questions, actually. So I like, what are you doing to connect guests to the property? And then what are you doing to connect guests to things to do in the city? And then from there, some have a concierge. I would say nowadays, most of the hotels we're talking to don't have a concierge. I would say most of them fall into the used to have a concierge, but haven't gotten one since COVID. And the answer is typically nothing, surprisingly, other than, they have the front desk. Obviously, people come up and ask questions, but yeah, just how are they currently doing it? And then I use your objective framework, which is like, how's it going? What are you currently doing? How's it going? And what are the challenges?
Which I think in Isaac's model here would be moving into building evidence, right? Which is like, well, what kind of cost is that giving to you? And you're literally pulling and organizing evidence from them that you don't even know the answer to, but you know the right categories of questions.
Right. We have a tough time is a lot of times this falls into the nice to have category more so than the must have, especially because we haven't really quantified like a specific ROI yet. So without that direct evidence, like, oh, this hotel XYZ implemented this and they saw, and then like return on investment here, or it's increased their numbers. So without that direct evidence, it's really tough to get a super strong, like, oh, this is something we have to have immediately. Now, this current one in Vegas was pretty quick. And that was specifically because they do like a lot of events on property. And so they were looking for something to promote and highlight their own things going on I think they're connected to the Las Vegas Convention Center, maybe. So this was a little bit higher of a need just because they do a lot of events and activities and brand activations on property. And so they were specifically looking for something to better communicate that to guests.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So transitioning back to you, Isaac, and you can probably use this to transition back into where you're going. What do you advise Michael around sometimes he's ending up in nice to have instead of need to have conversations?
Yeah, I mean, like for me, typically, when you think about ROI drivers, it's either save money, to produce more revenue, it's reduced risk, right? Like it's typically one of those three there's maybe a fourth or fifth driver, but like those are a lot of the three that I speak to. So like a good example of calibration is like, and Michael, by the way, like for your product, are you typically selling more to like high-end boutique hotels? Like, I guess what's the typical like price point that the hotels are offering rooms as? A more like luxury? Like what's do you have, is there a specific area of hotels that you sell to?
Yeah, we do have some independent boutiques, but recently we've been landing with the 500 plus rooms. I would say luxury, like Hyatt Regency and Marriott Renaissance were the last two. And then we have another Hyatt Unbound. So recently it's been more brands than independent boutiques.
Gotcha. But more,
it seems like
more
they
high-end hotels.
High-end. And I guess if I'm thinking it through, like I thought our customer was going to be the more smaller boutiques. But they don't, it seems to be like a nice to have for them because they have staff, and there's not as many rooms, right? But with the hotels, once you get to up and over 500 rooms, you just have a lot more people to satisfy and answer questions to. Mm-hmm. And so we've, strangely enough, we've found that the need is higher for the luxury branded hotels.
Gotcha. Understood. Yes, I think Isaiah, and Michael, when I think about this problem, like a good example of a calibration question that's pretty open-ended is like, tell me more about the kinds of guests, that this is me just as someone that like doesn't know very much about the hospitality industry, like tell me more about your guests. It's a pretty open-ended thing, right? But then when you think about, okay, how do we understanding more about the guests, like are they there for work? Are they there for travel? How long are they typically staying? Like those are things that are pretty general. But then like, for me, when I think about building evidence, that's like taking a little bit more further and like creating a little bit more swim lanes around the conversation to go further once you've done the calibration. Like, okay, I generally understand the guests, but then to understand like, what is their expectation from a hotel, right? Like, what is the competitive set they're evaluating every time they evaluate the city? What do those competitors do? Like, what is their level of concierge service? Are they more focused on things like customer acquisition or customer retention of existing things? Are they more motivated by, providing a exceptional positive experience or a good enough experience that they don't churn to another competitor, right? Like those are things that, from my perspective, again, nothing to do with qualifying the actual commercial opportunity. Like, do they have money, authority? It's not even explicit about like need. It's not asking like, what are your challenges? But these are good building evidence questions where you can start to build the building blocks, the links that now you can start to use to potentially build an argument. And maybe you don't use those to build an argument, but those are more pointed than like general open-ended, like, hey, just calibrate me on the problem. Like, what kind of guests do you have? What are you currently doing from a tools perspective, to more pointed questions that start to understand decision criteria, like what are the actual things that motivate them to buy. So that would be an example, Isaiah, of like moving from calibration to building evidence without explicitly going into qualification questions. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Awesome. Thanks, Isaac.
Yeah. So claim, warrant, impact, right? So claim is what you are stating is true. And specifically, like, in sales, it'd be what's going on, like what tools are you using? What is your concierge process? How many guests do you have? What kind of guests are typically coming in? The warrant is evidence for why your claim is true. So why is the problem that you're seeing, or not, maybe that you don't even see it as a problem, but the current state, like why is that happening, right? Why is that it happening, that is the current state, and these are the things that are coming out of the current state. And then the impact is why the truth of your claim matters, right, in debate. So in sales, it's what is the quantitative business impact? It's always in dollars, it's in percentages, or it's in specific numbers, right? But typically, when we think about selling to a business, it is they want to accelerate revenue, grow more revenue. It's to reduce their operating costs, or it is to reduce risk that may not necessarily have a dollar amount that is easily quantifiable, but it is certainly important, right? And then the last thing I would just say is like accelerating productivity, which is a subset of accelerating revenue, but this is like, time to market, time to value, things like that. So this is really the claim warrant impact framework. Now, one of the exercises that I did with my sales team that they found what was really interesting was we took the command of the message framework, and then I asked them, okay, in this point that you're making, let's say that the point that they're trying to make is data is siloed, and because of that, it takes people longer time to action on that data because they don't have the full view in a single place, right? Like that's a core argument that Grafana Labs, my company, often makes. And, I'd ask them, hey, what's the claim? What's the warrant? What's the impact? And I'd say 4 out of 5 times, what we found is that for most of these command of the message cases that our team was putting together, they had the claim, they had the impact, they either didn't have the warrant at all, or they had like half the warrant in the case. And this was really interesting, right? Because what we ended up finding was that they were under indexing on the warrant. They weren't doing a lot of the fleshing out of the logical links, the argument building in the warrant. And consequently, what they were finding is that the prospect either wasn't as bought in as they thought they were, but more interestingly, when they started applying the claim warrant impact framework, one of my sellers came back to me and said, what's so interesting is like, we validated the claim is true, and we validated the impact matters to the customer. But what we found out is that the warrants that we thought were actually causing the claim were completely different than the ones that we thought they were. They're completely different. And so the conclusion was still the same, but now that we understand the warrants of what the customer, what's really going on there, we actually understand that we need to change our talk track, right? We need to modify our talk track. We need to modify slightly how we're positioning the solution. And I've got, I think, an example of that somewhere in the slides here. I'll talk about examples there for a second. But I think in the discovery process in general, what I've observed coaching a number of salespeople now is that sellers typically focus a lot on the claim, like what's happening, and the impact, like this bad stuff is happening because of what's happening, but not a lot on why is it happening, right? And more specifically, what you think needs to happen for that to be solved. And so that's what we call, digging deeper into the warrants. And so,
Isaac, this is so funny because that's exactly what we found unlocked more advanced debaters as well, is they tended to want to focus on a sensational claim. And that's the problem with news too, right? Is learning to be critical thinking about it without focusing on the warrant. And so I'll give a quick example. Like if you want to say, Brazil's economy is in decline, that's a claim. But if you want to be warrant focused, you would say Brazil's currency has lost this much value this last year, and their GDP is down by X%. That's proving the claim. And when the debaters are doing a great job, they end up saying that stuff, and the audience makes the claim for them. And I wonder how true your experience matches that in sales when they start to focus on the warrant, how often client makes the claim in the end.
You're kind of almost like getting ahead to what one of my slides are here, but 100%, right? And you look at the example of like, you say Brazil's economy is in decline. That is your claim, right? The impact can be whatever it is, but the interesting thing here is that nobody builds their solution off of the claim. You build the solution based on what are the warrants, what are the links that have resulted in Brazil's economy being declining, and how do we change those links? How do we change those warrants? That is what a plan of action is built on, not the claim. Because you know, you could say, yeah, Brazil's economy is in decline. It doesn't tell us what the F we're supposed to do to fix it, right? The way that we know how to fix it is by identifying the warrants and how we can change that, right? So in the same way, like you could say, hey, like our HR recruiting process is super manual, right? Like this is, you know, Greenhouse and Bamboo HR and Workday, all these companies selling to that, Lever, whatever. But it's like, everyone can understand, yeah, our HR process is manual, but it's like, why is it manual? What does that actually mean? Once you dig into that, that's where you start to understand, okay, what does a solution look like, right? So 100% Isaiah, and this is where it really becomes advanced is if you can do discovery to tease out the warrants before ever explicitly stating the claim, and your prospect can arrive to that claim by themselves, it is so much more powerful from a persuasion standpoint than by you stating the claim or even asking a discovery question where they state the claim without first building the logical links and warrants. And so we'll talk about that here in a sec, being mindful of time. I'm going to kind of speed through this just for the sake of time, but I think this brings me back to that one piece, right, where I took the command of the message deck and I compared that to a policy debate case. And the one thing that's unique about policy debate is the whole focus on topicality, right? And this is something that, you know, my favorite sales book is called Let's Get Real or Let's Not Play. It's an amazing book. If you haven't read it, like I'll be honest, I generally hate sales books because I think it's a lot of times like rewriting the same shit in a different way and then charging you $15 for it. But like, with the exception of certain books, right? Let's Get Real, Let's Not Play is one of them. I think Isaiah's book, Upside Down Debate, honestly is super applicable to sales. It's more applicable to sales than most sales books I've read. But what they talk about here is asking the question of when someone uses a buzzword like data warehousing, right? It's like, hey, speak with a lot of different CIOs. When I ask them what data warehousing is, it's very different depending on who I ask, right? So like, what does that mean to you in the context of what you're trying to achieve? Like that's a topicality question, right? You're not asking them what's going on specifically with you. It's how do you understand this world? When we use these terms, when we use this nomenclature, how do you understand that, right? And that's really, really important that a lot of people miss early on in the discovery process. Because a lot of times what this will help identify, and I've seen this true at Grafana, is when I talk with a CIO of a Fortune 500 company, and when I talk with another CIO of a Fortune 500 company, a lot of times their understandings of concepts in our industry are different. And what helps that identify is one, like what are the things within this problem space, this general buzzword space that they're actually aware of, that they actually care about, where are the areas that we need to do education, like all of those things are unlocked by defining the rules of the game and defining the lay of the land. So that's one thing in discovery that I think a lot of people miss. But what ends up happening is, again, you start to make assumptions that are wrong that start to compound and snowball the further you move through your sales cycle, which becomes super detrimental. And a lot of times the reason why you might lose a deal. So I'll just call out that is an additional thing that I think is a lesson from debate that's really applicable in sales. When I talk about warrants, so the purpose of discovery, when I talk about building evidence, is that secondary objective. That is very parallel to what we call logic in debate. And so you're building these links that you don't need to prove are true because the customer has explicitly stated they are true or believe are true, right? So these are things that you can start to use as evidence because you don't have to prove it from a third party. You can prove it by saying, hey, like this is what you believe because you've stated this is what you believe, and therefore this. There's a lot of other things that you can use as your warrants for your argument building. The strongest ones are built through discovery, 100%. But for points where maybe this probably goes to Tara, what you said is like sometimes maybe they don't know, right? Exactly what are the warrants. This is where you can start to use things like expert testimony, right? We're quoting industry reports. Personal example, I would equate to like a customer or a case study of something that you've done to help out another customer why that's relevant, right? Historical examples, talking about the macro industry changes. This is a huge way to build credibility and evidence to talk about, hey, within this industry over the past 20 years, these are the huge macro shifts that have created these new problems, and understanding that you're aware of those and you've used that as the foundation or the basis for building your service, right? Statistics, surveys, or reports, law or precedent could be like regulations like GDPR. A maxim could be something like a framework, and a rumor is still a rumor. This is where you're like, well, I heard this competitor is doing this thing, why don't you talk with them and ask them these questions, right? Either way, these are the 8 different types of evidence, which, like, when you think about a sales process, when you think about what is your claim, right, and what is the impact, the warrant, the strongest warrants and logical links are built through discovery, but you can also use all of these other forms of evidence to go build a business case, to go build a plan for action, and specifically action with you and your company. And then lastly, this is the thing I was talking about. It's kind of like, I don't know, for as many of you have watched Inception, Inception is really like trying to plant an idea in a guy's head in his dream. So he thinks it's his idea. The best salespeople are the ones that are able to do this in sales. And the biggest way that you do this is by fleshing out your warrants before the claim is explicitly articulated or introduced. Because when they can say, hey, actually, you know what? They ask all these questions, and it's so obvious to me that this is the conclusion, and you're not the one that states the conclusion. They are persuaded in a way that is so much different than you saying it, because they believe it's their idea. And it is their idea, right? But a good seller creates those logical links where the implication is almost explicit, right? The second thing here is, again, a warrant-centric discovery. And this is an example of a sales process that we did here at Grafana, where initially the prospect was thinking, hey, it is just, we sell observability software. And they're like, hey, we're trying to solve this one problem in observability, right? And then what we said is, hey, but like, talk to us a little bit more broadly, like, about what is your goal? What is your job? What do you do? And then what we got them and convinced them through understanding what the warrants were was understanding, hey, you may be thinking about just solving this one problem, but actually, if you were able to solve this problem and this problem at the same time together, and thinking about this outside of myopic box and more broadly, if you're able to solve these 2 problems in tandem, well, guess what? That actually furthers basically what you're trying to do much farther than just thinking about this in a vacuum. And it was because we built so many warrants of, hey, actually, aren't these 2 problems pretty intertwined? And what ended up happening there was, if we were just thinking about solving that one problem, our competitor was so much better than us. By broadening the scope of the conversation, by having a warrant-centric discovery and not convincing the customer, but in their own words saying, hey, it's actually really important that we think about these 2 problems together, and solving these 2 problems together for the long term, that is what moved the decision criteria, where we reshaped their decision criteria in our favor. And that's how we won, I think it was a $1.5 million deal, right? And this is, like, again, like, very common of, like, when you start to shift towards a warrant-centric discovery, that becomes where you start to have a lot of leverage in influencing and reshaping the decision criteria they use to evaluate what actions they want to take. And then this is an example here, right? It's like, in debate, really, a warrant, like, a claim says, A leads to Z, right? So the claim leads to the impact. The warrant in debate, it says, well, you know what? We got to go build the logical links that get us to that conclusion. So it's actually A leads to X, and then X leads to Y1, and X also leads to Y2, and the Y's collectively lead to Z. Like, this is just the logical structure of an argument. And you're doing the same thing. The 2 companies that worked at Grafana Labs and Trendkite were similar things, where you got to build the logical links, right? So in the example of Grafana, like, again, our software basically, just to give like a case study here, our software basically pulls together real-time data feeds from different tools that are basically used to monitor the health of your software system. So like Netflix, or like even like Tesla software, or like Uber or Lyft, like, they all use our stuff to basically feed in data. It's like, hey, like, is the app working? Is the app down? Are users hitting errors? Is the underlying infrastructure bad? And they have it across a lot of different tools, right? And so our core value proposition of what we're trying to sell is like, hey, your data is siloed in a lot of different places, which means that when you're trying to resolve an incident that's actually happening, you got to jump to a lot of different tabs in your browser, a lot of different UIs, and that becomes jarring. It means that your time to resolve incidents is a lot longer, right? And so what a lot of sellers would do is think about, hey, okay, our enterprise product has these like 15 integrations with off-the-shelf products that people typically use. Let's go identify, okay, someone uses 3 of those products. Great. Let's talk about our enterprise product that can bring those 3 products together. But we're operating off the assumption, right? The warrant that was never stated or identified or discovered, that those multiple disparate tools, those disparate data feeds were actually used in the same incident response workflow, right? So a lot of times people will be like, oh, you use Datadog, MongoDB, Splunk, cool. You can pull all that data together in Grafana without actually identifying, like, when you have an incident, what's the first tool that you start with, right? When you start with that tool, what's the data that you're getting from that? What other data sources or context cues are you looking for from the other tools in that incident? Okay, what are those tools, right? What does that workflow look like? And so this is digging deeper, this warrant-centric discovery, really digging deep to make sure that that link or that assumption that we have is actually true. And this is something that like I worked with a lot of smart sellers at Grafana that like have been doing this for 20, 30 years, but they were missing that piece, which was causing us to come in and pitch a solution where we were making a faulty assumption that that actually added value to them and it didn't, right? And so the implication here, or how you can go apply this to your own process, right, is what are the assumptions that I am making about the claim that would make the impact happen, right? And then from there is how do we ask deeper questions to really go validate, one, that that's true, that assumption is true, and then 2, that we can get complete awareness and calibration around the more broader things that perhaps also help us understand what are the additional sales plays that maybe we haven't thought about before, or what are other things that are links that we could potentially use to support another claim in the future. And so I know like this is where I was like, shit, like this might be kind of like too theoretical, so not applying it to your specific situations. I think this is something that can certainly be continuation with Isaiah of how to apply this framework, because guess what? He's the one that taught it to me. But this is really where I've worked with my reps to really apply this framework to identify areas of misdiscovery. And then lastly, and I'll breeze through this because I realize we only have.
Well, yeah, what I was going to suggest, Isaac, is maybe we just pause there.
Cool.
Pick up CX another day and work through one case in the table, because I feel like the table that you just showed is that's the main dish here. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool. So I'm going to highlight one thing from something you said earlier in this call, which is, and the right solution is the one that reverses the links, right? That's the one that when the client is like, yeah, those links exist, and then you're able to insightfully say, well, there's a way to eliminate all 3 of these links together. They go, really? And now you're into solution zone.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to offer to either Mindy or Jake, if you want to put your one of your sales problems on the table here, we can actually build one of these columns with you in real time.
And I'll stop my share, Isaiah, unless you think it's helpful to leave this on the screen.
That's great. Yeah, we can pull over to the whiteboard.
Yeah, let's do it.
Mindy, do you want to give it a go, or Jake?
I'm sort of inclined to let Jake go. I'm taking aggressive notes over here.
So I don't think my deal's in a stage where it's actually, like, I think I said this in the notes, I don't think it's like useful yet. I'm still just like going over email with him basically in due diligence. It's just like, he's like, hey, do you have this? I'm like, yeah, here's this. Hey, do you have this? Yeah, here's this. And I don't think there's like much of a framework to apply to it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's kind of where I'm at.
Okay. Then I'll say, Mindy, if you don't want to go, we'll let Michael go, or we can just go general Q&A.
I could give it a shot with Tamara too, with that in mind, if you wanted to, although that's quite a ways up ahead.
That's a great idea. Let's do it. Let's go. I'm going to pull up the whiteboard.
Cool.
Here. And Isaac, I'm your puppet. So what
I
I
think let's tag team this, man, because from my perspective, I mean, this is your bread and butter too in terms of
cool.
claims warrants
Cool.
impact.
So
So
we're going to coach you through this, Taro, as best we can, but as much you can intuit, just go for it.
great. As I said, I mentioned, I'm a PM at this company where we're building a reverse logistics solution. And what that means basically is when you take a product, manufacture it, transport it, put it on the shelf, that's forward logistics. Reverse logistics is taking that inventory, which you no longer want there because maybe it's open box, refurbished, broken, or return, and still getting some kind of return out of it, while also, not dumping it straight up if that's, even an option. There is a lady called Tamara who works for a company called Ingram Micro, which is one of the biggest distributors and I believe manufacturers for products like electronics, et cetera, in the United States and the world to some extent. She works on a team of 2. It's just her and Stephanie, and they manage a ton of reverse logistics, primarily in consumer electronics for Ingram Micro. She currently, her solution to find people to buy her product is to have a spreadsheet export of her inventory that she's responsible for. And she emails that to a bunch of potential customers, I think about 300 of them on like a weekly basis or so. That process is very time consuming. And I guess you could say old school. And I apologize. I definitely need to clarify in my own head how I want to think about describing this and pitching it. But basically, what we want to try to do is give her more buyers and then also help her help her hasten or quicken price discovery. Because one thing she has to do very frequently, about every 60 days, is go online and check the market prices for a lot of her products and consolidate that and then update all of her auction listings and such. And just to throw it out there, the 2 things that are at the top of her mind, like at all times, is the age of her product, between 0 and 15 days, 15 to 30, 30 to 45, et cetera. And then just her buyers and how happy they are and that buyer pool and how many she's like finding or acquiring per week or per quarter.
Okay. So, so give her more buyers is a positive business outcome. So let me ask you, is the painful time consuming process with spreadsheets contributing to not having as many buyers?
Great question. Honestly, probably not much, or it's probably not affecting it much. Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's an important piece, give her more buyers, but that actually might be a different claim, right? Because typically when we think about impacts, they should be relevant to the claim that changing the warrants will by changing the warrants, it will have a positive or impact on the actual business impact, right? So I would say it's something good to call out here, but it would be thinking about, all right, what is the underlying claim that would contribute to not having as many buyers, and the inverse of that is, what would we have to do to create more buyers? I don't know, Isaiah, if you disagree with that, but that's typically how I think about where do I categorize positive business outcomes and negative consequences.
I love where you're going. Keep going. So I'm hearing that I erased that one claim and I'm thinking more along the lines of like, it takes too much effort to get good offers on this liquidating inventory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so, I think that some of the calibration is a little bit of like at a high level, like what does their process look like, right? So when you say it's very time consuming and old school, I mean, I know you mentioned the spreadsheet, but like, have you done sort of a journey with her of like walking through like sort of what is the actual step-by-step process?
Yeah, absolutely. I can start from like when the return authorization happens, basically. Oh, yeah. Okay. I'll try to do it pretty quickly. Let's say you buy an iPhone and you don't like it for whatever reason. Maybe it's already scratched for some reason or broken or whatever. You ship it back to the warehouse or the location they give you. They look at the product to determine whether or not they even sell that product in the first place. Could be wrong, the wrong location. They check the grade and condition of it. They issue something called a return authorization, or an RA for short. They then rigorously grade that for its condition with like a very robotic flow chart that an associate goes through step by step. Finally, it's logged in their inventory management system or software. She goes to that software. You can just kind of think of that inventory management software as like a big spreadsheet of all the inventory that Ingram Micro is responsible for. She filters that spreadsheet specifically for products that are going in the reverse direction, so being returned, et cetera, or have been. And then she exports that, and then she updates or she adds additional columns, like asking price or market price, not quantity, grade. She has to add grade, I think, in some cases, notes, et cetera. And then a big column for her clients. And then she takes that spreadsheet, makes it public on Google Sheets, I guess you could say, or Excel, throws it into an email where she gives like a deadline. And then every buyer has to respond to that email thread, which is, again, like about 300 buyers. And not every single one, but a lot of them do respond. And she has to go through every spreadsheet, determine which one won, right? So if the spreadsheet is like 100 rows, she has to go through maybe 150 different spreadsheets and figure out which, I mean, if she's smart, she compiles them all in one big spreadsheet and then just determines the biggest one through some logic or like the best bid. But yeah, it's a very rigorous process to rein back in all those spreadsheets and determine your winners per row.
Okay, that's super helpful. So then let's talk about basically out of this process, the actual value that we can provide to her by introducing automation and stuff is basically post this all being logged in inventory management software, right? Or are you actually able, does your product have impact on the stuff prior to the logged in IMS stage?
It's primarily after that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So then because my point here would be then this would be a good indication of us to go do some discovery on the points prior to that other people have, our stakeholders in. But okay, that makes sense. And then my question, so I guess my next question would be, what we said that this is manual and time consuming. What's your hypothesis on like what the negative consequence of that is? What's the impact of that?
Well, currently,
it's a lot of time, but like, what else would she be doing with that time, or what is she able to do because
she would be working on acquiring more buyers, have higher throughput for reverse logistics, so she could take on more inventory to reverse, get more of a return out of her product. So, like by auctioning your product, you arrive at like price discovery a lot faster and more effectively, I guess you could say, because right now she has to like determine that price on her own, and that can, within a 60-day cycle of determining those prices, that can be outdated pretty quickly. Yeah. And then also I think helping enlighten the rest of the company as to why reverse logistics is actually a pretty important facet of business and how it can contribute to like revenue overall, like a lot more.
Okay. So these are all really good impacts of like areas, but this is, I think, then where we can go build some more warrants for like, how do we actually solve these? Because I think the solution or the functionality that you need to have to bring about these different outcomes are a little bit different. There would be different functionality. So when you talk about like working on acquiring more buyers, like what's the process for that? How do you grow that list from 300?
So she, before us, and what we would provide for her, she used to fly out to conferences and speak with customers or buyers, as well as potential ones. She'd also just visit them straight up at their manufacturing locations or retail stores. And that was a great way for her to foster new and retain old buyers.
Okay.
Now her company no longer allows for that, or no longer budgets for that. So she can't do that. She gets a lot less buyers now. What we're proposing is essentially offering her access to a growing buyer pool that's kind of like shared between different other customers of our own. Yeah, essentially just like an online, almost like a LinkedIn, if you will, for buyers.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so that would be an avenue then for delivering more buyers, and then the higher throughput, meaning more inventory. Does that mean that there's current product that is not being reverse logistic, or I don't know what the right term is, that because lack of bandwidth?
Yes. Yeah. She's primarily responsible for electronics, as far as I understand.
Okay. Oh, okay. So there are certain products that just like straight up are not being resold? Or just what
Well,
happens?
it's all got to go somewhere, either to the landfill or sold. And from what I understand, there are other people also doing reverse logistics at the company. It's quite a big company.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but so this is where I would say that there needs to be more warrant building to understand like what are specific products that are being landfilled because she doesn't have time, right? Are there? Because there may be an assumption that there are more products that she can go sell if she has more time, but if that's like completely under someone else's purview, that doesn't impact her. That you can't include that in the ROI calculations, that multi-threading and expanding out to more stakeholders in this purchase, right? So that's an example of like, I mean, you may have already done this. I'm just kind of talking this generally to the team, but it's like, all right, understanding like what are the specific products that are going to the landfill or just being completely wasted because there's no time saving, so that actually is a warrant that you can go build your business case on.
Okay. Yeah.
Awesome. So Isaac, I feel like this is like a really strong model that we've just developed, and your suggestion is basically keep building a list of this and then go ahead and do what we talked about of reduce that list to the sharpest ones, right?
And go drive deeper on those warrants, right? It's like understand like, okay, like a warrant here, a link here is like, hey, basically you have less time because you don't have enough time. It means that inventory is basically being thrown out instead of resold. But like go dig deeper on that warrant, go build links for that link, right? And that's like, again, how you start to do deeper discovery to go validate that those assumptions are true. Because ultimately it's like, we can say that, but if we don't actually know, one, like what those products are that are being left on the table, and two, like what is the dollar amount of that, the strategic importance of that to the company, is that actually a compelling warrant to take action? Like maybe not, right? So that's kind of the argument there. But I think, Tara, you've laid out an excellent framework, and I think this framework then gives you what are the lines of questioning that can ask for each one of those warrants to go dig deeper and to really like be able to build out an end-to-end super compelling quantifiable ROI for taking action.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm a complete sales novice and I had no clue how to like frame this or pitch this to her. She's got like decades upon decades of experience in the industry. And I have zero sales experience and borderline no experience in the industry. So for me to frame this to her is very intimidating. So this helps a lot. Thank you.
Dude, this is awesome. Like this is an exciting one. I could spend like an hour just like talking through this stuff with you, because I think this is like the perfect example of like where to apply the claim it warrants impacts framework to go really figure out almost like, and when you start out with sales, it's very much, man, like it's baby steps, you know what I mean? But it's like, so sometimes you have to like write out the laundry list, but understanding why the laundry list is in the order that it is, it's the first step to then being able to call audibles and do that on the fly, you know? So
I like that way of putting it, the laundry list. Yeah. That's kind of what it is in my head right now.
Well, Isaac, we have hit time. I want to keep going. This is so fun, but I know we'll have to have a second date here on this stuff. I really want to thank you for lending your expertise to this and throwing together a strong theoretical foundation that I want to keep building on. So great job, and thanks from all of us for joining us today.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, guys. This is a lot of fun. I know I pitched Isaiah's book a lot. I promise I'm not getting paid for this. I don't get paid every time his book's sold, but one of the main reasons why I did this, beyond just like me loving to nerd out about this stuff, is you guys have a pretty incredible leader in Isaiah. He is one of the most influential people that I've had in my life, and like where I am today is some of the stuff that he's taught me. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be able to like sort of repackage and reshare that back with y'all. So yeah, appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Isaac. All right, we'll distribute this out via email and keep you all posted on where it goes from here.
Okay.